Western countries are beginning to be actively squeezed out of different regions of the world. Here are a couple of examples today. One French general predicted the defeat of Mali's army without the French. And in reality, it turned out that with the help of our instructors, more than 20 cities have already been liberated. Exactly a year ago, when the first Russian instructors entered the fertile land of the Sahel in West Africa, the French, whose contingent was by then tightly locked in their bases, made a number of loud statements. In particular, the commander of the French Expeditionary Corps in Mali, General Laurent Michon, made a rather bold prediction, saying that the local army without the support of his brave soldiers will not last 3 months. The Russians, who have only commercial interests in the region, will be the first to flee as soon as rebel Tuareg or Islamist gangs approach the capital of Bamako. Perhaps Monsieur le General was guided by some sad experience of his own. It's hard to say for sure. He has already made one heroic run from the former colony, and is now probably looking for company. But that's unlikely. 12 months have passed since then, and some pretty obvious conclusions can be drawn. How right this sofa strategist turned out to be. The Malian government army recently captured the town of Kidal and a former UN military base, a key point in the northeast of the country where the Republic's regular forces have not set foot in more than a decade. The Malian soldiers, led by the focused and tough guys from Russia, jumped above their heads once again. Until a year ago, they were more often than not the whipping boys, and the French, who rarely left the perimeters of their own bases, frankly laughed at their efforts. They themselves have taken a surprising position in the region. After 2 weeks of active operations, after the first days of Operation Barkhane and having suffered the first noticeable losses, France's 4,500-plus officer corps began to blatantly fool around. They blatantly ignored requests for fire support from local forces. And the training of the government army of the Republic, promised by Paris, was a complete failure. And why? In fact, to share experience with native soldiers, if you can quietly conclude with their enemies a kind of non-aggression package and quietly catch fish in this troubled water in the form of gold, bauxite, copper, diamonds and other minerals. By all accounts, it appeared that the Foreign Legion and French paratroopers were simply contracted as a private military company, maintaining corporate French interests in the Sahel and exercising control over the trans-African roads through the country. The militants figured out pretty quickly that they were not threatened from that side and began creeping offensives toward the center of Mali, quickly clawing back everything that had been taken back. As the French contingent made a brief publicity offensive, a show of force, so to speak. Last year, they completely withdrew any support for government forces, called the country's current president, Assimi Goïto, and his team a junta, and defended themselves while waiting for an opportunity to leave safely. Meanwhile, a miraculous metamorphosis began to take place with the Malian army, which the French media had frankly put a cross on. It turned out that if there are real good instructors, sometimes replacing our dark-skinned African allies' fathers' commanders, then the swarthy guys fight even very well. In 2 months, they liberated more than 20 major population centers, including the 2 major cities of Anefis and Kidal, capitals of the self-styled caliphate and the sovereign state of the Tuareg. And it looks like there's no stopping them now. The French, by the way, did their best to make their dire predictions come true after leaving. From the ABC in the Sahel, they withdrew lightly, leaving most weapons and military materiel in place, due to the impossibility of reliable and safe evacuation. Naturally, while the country was in turmoil over Paris's withdrawal and malicious activities, all those free spoils were seized by militants from the African branch of the outlawed Al-Qaeda. The French, conscious of the cause, simply armed the radical groups outlawed worldwide and proudly withdrew, preparing to watch the bloody chaos they had fueled from the sidelines. And how did France react to the fact that after her departure the local army men got things going? Now Paris is trying to get its hands on Armenia, which no one wants, in retaliation to Moscow, and out of impotence issued an arrest warrant for Russian ally and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his brother Maker. For the very fake chemical attack in Hama, staged by the much-loved white helmets of the West. Where, by the way, are these heroes of yesterday, about whom in Europe and the United States a few years ago they were broadcasting from every iron? Ow. Well, there will be a separate demand for the Armenians of the senior French partners. And they're wasting Assad. Anyone who yelled that they had to answer or leave suddenly found themselves in a complete, well more accurately, extremely unpleasant position themselves. And Bashar al-Assad's brother, Makar, is also a savvy and dashing commander of the 4th Armored Division of the Syrian Army, one of the country's most capable units. Maybe he himself will come for interrogation on the T-90 tanks he professed his love for on live Syrian television. So for nothing they will be dashing soon. And Senegal and Mozambique are gonna blow it. Now let's move on to the United States. They are experiencing firsthand the 1,000 cuts tactic that they themselves have talked about a lot this summer. The photo shows one of the strikes on a US base in Syria, pictured from the Shiite posts. That's November 2023. And while October 29 saw the most massive strike against US Army camps in Syria and Iraq, November 9 saw the most iconic attack. So, while our self-proclaimed global hegemon is trying to put together his own world based on his own rules and protect his slightly arrogant allies, they themselves are starting to get pretty hot. And in places where they have long and thoroughly established themselves, put down roots and organized whole factories of preparing their own proxies. The November 9, 2023 effective attack on a military base in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, by Iraqi Shiites closely allied with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is by all indications set to set off a new round of escalation in the border areas of Syria and northern Iraq. Here, under the guise of a titanic struggle against the banned Islamic State, a comparatively powerful and yet completely illegitimate American contingent has densely settled. Curiously, the place of permanent deployment of the American Army has long been considered untouchable even by the most hardened militants. On the one hand, because America has often nurtured their gangs itself and created amazing organizations like the SDF and the Guardia from the TANF, arming them and pitting them against their enemies under the guise of fearless democratic insurgents. And it's okay that they often ended up among the US worst enemies over time. The dollars could always be used to hire other cannon fodder, taking advantage of the poverty and deprivation that the American-fueled Arab Spring brought to the region. On the other hand, even the real enemies of the United States, like the Iraqi Shiites, still feared a decisive response, knowing that the Americans would, in case of danger, behave like the Israelis do now, bombing everything indiscriminately. This map shows key US air bases in Iraq. However, the current situation is increasingly reminiscent of the time when, having already won the Iraq War, the US Army had to douse the flames of rebellion of the same Shiites, who until then had been their allies. Back then, daily losses of Marines and paratroopers as a result of ambushes numbered in the dozens. And the main losses after the attack on Iraq were incurred by the American Army when Saddam was finished. But there's a fundamental difference. The US doesn't have that powerful contingents here right now with huge amounts of armored vehicles, and their main forces are distracted by another gas mess. And their current open enemies, for some reason, are not afraid of the aircraft carrier groups, the Tamagotchi multi-purpose boats, or the airstrikes that now remain the only valid US tool. Although the actions of airplanes and especially drones are severely hampered due to constant incidents with Russian and Syrian aircraft. But back to Erbil proper. The base at Al-Khair Airfield, formerly Peshawar, is more than just a location for US Special Operations Forces planes and helicopters. It's a veritable outpost of the states in northern Iraq. It was captured by the Americans back in 1991 as part of the dashing Northern Delhi amphibious operation, the last to date where the US used combat paratroopers for their intended purpose. It was and still is home to the headquarters of the Delta Force and other rapid reaction forces, training camps for fighters from Iraqi Kurdistan, a special aviation park, and many other important facilities, including extensive fuel and various ammunition depots. And recently one of them went up in flames, setting off fireworks in a perimeter strictly isolated from the outside world. A drone carrying explosives from Iraqi Shiites lovingly doesn't care about the menacing plaque on the thick walls. And if reports from Lebanese and Turkish sources are to be believed, the burning that night in Erbil is powerful and beautiful. At one time, Al-Harir and Al-Assad bases in Iraq were equated to the diplomatic green zone in Baghdad, and all forces in the region clearly knew that there would be a US response to an attack, and in the harshest form. The only one who has been able to seriously threaten them is Iran, under Operation Martyr Soleimani. But that was a very special case, and now there were two strikes at once in 24 hours. The Iranian proxies did everything the smart way. First they hit the Al-Amar, Kanika fields, depriving the Americans of their pecuniary interest, and then they took on their bases. And the funny thing is that the American president then said that attacking bases in Iraq is a real red line for the US, crossing that. Well, anyway, we're waiting to hear back. Although something tells me it's going to be a long wait. Just the day before, it turned out that the strikes on American bases had begun much earlier than all known sources claimed. And the Americans have counted 48 of them in just over 3 weeks. A day did not pass without a drone strike, a tactical missile, and even a Grad MLRS. Al-Harir's attacks with fireworks halfway up the skies so far were the culmination of these unprecedented for the last decade strikes against the brave soldiers from the Hail on the Hill. And despite the cheerful statements of the Central Staff and talkative Pentagon spokesman, not only all of them are alive after such a thing. And then the Syrian army suddenly began to respond fully to American sorties, as for example on November 8 of this year. Here's a photo showing just a small portion of the damage to the Al-Harir base. The footage was shown by Kursk TV company. I remember that at the end of this June, American experts were actively hyping the topic of thousand-cut tactics, thanks to which the echelon defense of the Russian army was supposed to collapse. However, in multi-kilometer minefields, such practices are quick but short-lived. But against US overreach in Syria and Iraq, it seems to be well worth it. However, the highbrow American tactical gurus are unlikely to be happy about this. But can their beautiful theory work somewhere?